Hey there, hello, good morning. Welcome to our brand new painting lesson. Here we are going to render this lovely sunset, some boats on the water, these quite complex clouds, and we're going to start with our 1-inch flat-headed brush. Always great for backgrounds and blocking things in. We'll make sure that it's a little bit damp, so we'll dip the head of it into some water, wipe off the excess. This will keep our paint wet for a bit longer, and it'll help us beat the drying time of acrylics. Now I'm going to grab about equal parts cadmium yellow DPU and a cadmium orange. We're starting on the horizon there. A little bit of titanium white to thicken up the pigment and desaturate it. And we want a decent amount. So now we'll just go in. First strokes on the canvas, nice and easy. Working on the horizon, and I will cover up portions of my drawing, but that's okay. We can always go back and resketch it in later. Every time we sketch it, we familiarize ourselves with the subject more and more, and that feels good. Will lead to a better painting. That said, we're going to bring this up to right about where these clouds are. And it's worth noting, if you'd like help with the drawing process, you can find the traceable up over on Patreon. You can also find the real-time drawing video of me sketching it out on the canvas. So if you really just want to jump into the painting process and you want the drawing to feel a bit more easy and accessible, that is an option. You can also get the ad-free version of this video up over on Patreon as well, and there'll be a link to that in the description. But with that, we are going to grab more of our cad yellow, more of our titanium white. We'll start transitioning into the yellow we can see in our reference photo. So we'll apply this initially above the orange, again, slightly working around our current clouds. And because our brush is damp, the orange we just applied should still be wet, and quite wet. So we'll start working this down. Soft gradient, very little pressure with the brush. The more pressure you add, the more streaky it will look. So we're really trying to avoid that. And you can see that I'm slightly cleaning my brush with each mix. Now we need to start transitioning this into the blue towards the top, and the best way to do that is to render more of a gray in the center. You can really see that in the reference, and we're going to do so by grabbing an abundance of our titanium white. We'll work that right through here. And that's actually pretty good. Let's add a hint of Mars Black, just a hint. You can see I'm grabbing it with the corner of my brush. Make that pretty wide. And that's lovely. That's a great transitional pigment. So, we'll just apply this right atop our last application. And I do mean atop. I don't want it to be in the last application just yet. We want this to be applied all the way across the edge, because if we apply it and we already start blending, we'll probably run into a little bit of an issue in that where it's blended, it'll have a lot more of the orange, and then we'll bring it on over to the other side, which will progressively get more orange. So this way we have a clean brush. And here you can see I'm trying to work around a lot of the clouds. I might cover some of them up and just resketch it. But now we'll grab more of that pigment. We'll head in to the last application. We'll go for a little bit of a blend. It should still be wet because, again, we've kept our brush damp. That's nice. Alright, so now we have this area which isn't too yellow heavy, and that's important before we move into the blues, because if we added the blues at the top and then we move them down into that yellow-orange, we get a lot of green as the yellow and the blue mix. So now again, we have a transitional gray. We'll grab more of our titanium white, work that through here, and for the first time we'll grab a hint of our ultramarine blue. We don't want a lot of it, but just enough to start giving us that more cool hue within the rest of it. Again, I have started covering a lot of my clouds. That's okay. There we are. This will look really pretty. Just have patience. Also, I feel like we really just jumped into this. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're feeling creative. I hope all of the warmer weather has you excited about creating brighter, warmer art. We had a couple of days here in Toronto that felt quite warm, and immediately I just thought, you know what, it's time to do more of a summer piece, work on a sunset, something that just feels, oh my, good. And that's what we're doing here. So we're doubling down on our ultramarine blue in the next mix. We're heading right atop our previous area, and we're filling this in. Now, typically, I like to start these videos where you can see me and the rest of oh my, the space, but we are currently moving, and one of the reasons we are moving is because the construction outside has gotten a little bit loud. I'm trying to paint around the areas that are loud and the areas that are a bit more quiet, and I thought this was the right time. But if it continues to be loud, I will put the brush down and we'll reapproach this in a little bit. But soon, there will be no construction noise, and we can get back to just the relaxed, great ASMR sounds of these lessons. Also, pro tip, when there are little hairs and such, little strands of bristles that you find in your canvas, don't pick them out with your finger. Use your brush and go at it on an angle. That'll pick it up much more easily, and you won't deliver any of the oils from your hand onto the canvas, which is important because said oils can make it difficult for paint to adhere to the canvas, and you have these spots that just kind of feel empty. That said, it is a little loud. I'm going to end this clip for just a second, and then when it's a little quieter outside, we will proceed. But this is actually great timing because what we needed to do was a thick layer from top to bottom and a good transition while it was all wet, and we did get that. If you feel like it's too thin, go back in, do a second layer, but this is really what we're looking for. Alright, so now while we let that dry, we're going to head down into the water here, and that means we are rendering yet another gradient. However, this one's going to be a little bit tighter in general. So I'm going to put my reference photo right here, have that there. I think I want my water to be a bit darker, a bit more saturated. Typically, reflections are darker than that which they reflect. So we'll grab more of our orange, cad yellow, hint of titanium white, but not as much as before. And we'll apply that right under here. Now, as you can see, we are starting to cover some of our boats, and that's okay. I'm going to attempt to work around them, but even if I have just a small area of canvas still showing, then I'll know where it is, and that'll be good enough. So we'll just start by blocking in some of this beautiful color. Always love working with cadmium orange. I feel like it's an uncommon color for people to have in their palettes, but I feel like it just does so much so quickly, and a lot of mixed oranges are semi-opaque. They're quite thin because you're mixing them with a lot of cadmiums, where this is actually relatively thick, which is nice. So, good start there. Now let's add a lot of titanium white and our cad yellow deep hue. We're using a cad yellow deep hue, by the way, instead of a cad yellow because it's a lot warmer. It's also a bit more of a thick pigment. So yet again, really just trying to consider opacities. We'll apply that all the way across as we do, and then we'll go in for the blend, and we'll try to make it relatively even, like so. Now we'll start to move out towards the bottom, where again, we transition into a gray, and one of the real beauties of reflections like this is it gives us an opportunity to paint a subject twice, really reinforce how to paint it, really reinforce the mixes it takes to get there. So when you want to render something in the future in a new painting, you'll be very well versed, you'll memorize how to work it, and you have a good understanding. So, great start. Now we double down on the titanium white. We add a hint of the Mars black. Remember, this can be darker because it is a reflection, so we might add a little bit more of the Mars black or Oxide black. I believe I said Mars black. I believe I'm working with an Oxide black. I used to get a Winsor & Newton Mars black, but I haven't been able to find it for a long time. So now I'm switched to an Amsterdam Oxide black, and I'm really liking it. We'll grab some Ultramarine blue, work that into our mix. We are going to attempt to not paint my phone, but you never know. It could happen. Grab a bit more. It seems like the construction sounds are a lot better. It just started to rain outside, which I always love when painting. I just feel like it's such a relaxed setting. Really creates that atmosphere where you don't question, oh, maybe I should be going out, maybe I should be doing this or that. It's, okay, you know what? No, today we can really just sit down, relax, get creative, sink into it. So that's a real blessing of spring, I feel. I feel like when I make these lessons, I talk a lot about the seasons and the weather. And, you know, the weather is one of those funny things where when you're at a social event, a gathering, and you start talking about it, people are like, oh, it's not a real conversation. It's like an icebreaker. But I feel like when you're painting, when you're an artist, the weather has such an impact on what you want to make, how you feel, the atmosphere. I feel like that just has a real impact. So it's something I feel like I'm always very hyper cognizant of, especially coming out of the winter. I think a lot of people get seasonal depression, and just seeing a rainfall, feeling a sunset. These are things that, you know, on the surface might seem like that which we can look past, but it does make the life just feel so much better. That said, we're doubling down on the blues, the Oxide blacks, really trying to bring this gradient up and forward. Very good, very good. Adding a lot of water into my mix. Just like so. Remember that this area can be darker. And we're going to add a lot of texture and movement into it. Let me show you. Not exactly like this, but certainly similar to a point, though we do need a simple base before we do that. And I think we're just about there. So make sure you have a nice thick base, that it's opaque, and you know what? I missed an area right there. And then once we have what we want, we can jump into the next step. Okay, so we're back. This is fully dry to the touch. I resketched in quite a few of those clouds again, and we are going to do our mix with the larger flat-headed brush, though we will switch to something else to actually apply the pigment for our clouds. That said, the mix for our clouds, as you can see, quite dark. For the most part, it is a blue. It might have a hint of orange in it, and it is darker than that which we have down here. So I'm going to make my mix on the palette right where I had my previous darker blue mix. We still want some titanium white in it because it isn't purely a silhouette. We want a little bit of our cadmium orange in it to complexify that color. Typically, blue and orange will gray out a little bit together because they are complementary colors, and when you add a complementary color with another one, that's typically what happens. But I think this is a pretty good start to the mix, and for the actual application, we are going to switch on over to our filbert brush right here. Now, as you can see, it is rounded corners. That makes it great for subjects like clouds. Alternatively, we have something like a flat-headed brush, and you can see this is completely sharp. This is better for this scenario, and we'll start by grabbing some of that pigment. Now you could wet it first, but I do want a nice thick application, especially in the middle of these clouds. So I'm actually going to go in with a dry brush, a little bit different. And I think a lot of people feel like you need water to get soft blends. It can help, it's not entirely always necessary. And I'll show you what I mean. Here I'll just use the edge of the brush, and I'll work towards these edges, and I'll try to allow the paint to run out as we get towards those edges, and that'll give us a bit of a softer look, like so. However, for the most part, we're actually going to use a different brush for our edges. This is just if you want a really subtle, edgeless cloud. I think the ones in the reference photo are a bit more structured. And I also think, taking a look at this and this, I want this mixture to be a little bit brighter. So I'm glad we just did a little bit so far. We'll interject some additional titanium white into the mix, like so. Maybe we'll grab some of this. Ooh, it already looks a lot better. It's subtle, but subtleties are how we make paintings that we love. Okay, so that's a good start. Now we're getting into areas of the cloud through here and here, which are quite small. And I did simplify the clouds a bit because I didn't want them to be too dramatic, too detailed. We are switching to a liner brush. We are going to make that nice and damp. It'll condense our bristles. This is the best for real details. And then we can create these little offshoots to the clouds. And all of the minute intricacies we probably wanted to incorporate before, but it just wasn't feasible with that many bristles. So this is where we bring in a lot of personality. That said, I'm going to use this brush for a little while. We're not going to be changing our mixture in the near future. So I think I'm going to zoom you in a little bit, and we'll work on these details together. Now I am going to take artistic liberties, and that means we're not doing exactly what we have in the reference photo, but we are using it as a general guide. I think at the end of the day, reference photos are wonderful for helping us see subjects in new ways, interject ideas that we wouldn't otherwise have thought about. However, I also think often natural compositions are imperfect compositions, and we can add additional leading lines or balance things in a more intentional way. So I like to work with reference photos to grab that benefit of additional understanding, but I also like to make these pieces my own and make some alterations. Now towards the bottom of the cloud, I'm going to make those less detailed. They're farther away. Perspective is going to compress them, so we're not going to see all of the little offshoots in the same way. We'll have a couple, but for the most part we want the bottoms of the clouds to be more simple. And that's what we're actively working to achieve right here. There we go. There we go. And then we'll start creating the tail of it. That'll bring us towards the center. And I really like this cloud. I think this is a very necessary cloud because you want subjects which bridge areas of the painting into other areas. You don't want just clouds on the left, clouds on the right. You want ones that kind of take you on a journey and keep the eye moving in a more dynamic way. Now we have another cloud right here, and these two kind of dance around one another. This will be interesting because we started our last cloud with the filbert, and then we switch to the liner. With this one, I'm going to try to show you start to finish just using the liner. When you're working with paint or really any artistic medium, it's, I think, freeing to note, to understand that while there are, I guess, optimal ways of approaching things, there are so many ways of approaching them, and not every way is for every person. Sometimes we have a preferred brush, a preferred technique. Some of us are eager to get a lot of paint on the canvas, at which point you do start with the filbert. Some of us like to take more time and approach everything in a very delicate manner. And in that scenario, you can do all of your clouds like I am here with the liner. I don't think there's really a right or wrong. I kind of go back and forth depending upon how I'm feeling, but I wanted to show you that there are multiple ways of going about it and encourage you to try multiple and see where you land with it. Now, in the reference photo, I can see there's this cloud, which is a little bit larger, and then we have another one right under it. I like that idea a lot. So here, I'm going in yet again with the liner, and I'm doing so very intentionally because we are getting closer to the bottom. When we do, the clouds will appear smaller because, again, perspective will just make them so. We're also going to need to go back and lighten up a lot of these clouds towards the bottom because when they are here, they have more light. They're closer to the horizon. But that is a future step. Our clouds also become much more horizontal, as you can see, where up here they get more diagonal, more full in the early stages. In the distant stages, though, it's a lot of taps and drags in ways that feel like we're just pushing the eye left and right. I'm going to take some artistic liberties, deviate from the reference, deviate from the sketch. Once I start to feel it out, get a better idea of what we're working with, what we're working towards. Ooh, I love those. Already it feels like a very vast sky. There's a lot of open space, but there's also a lot of cloud, and the variance in size of cloud is going to create a lot of additional depth in your painting. The more size variance you have, the more you can show scale, and the smaller the clouds you have will make the bigger clouds look even bigger, right? That's a big part of it. So, I really like that. I really like that. I think I'm going to do another layer on this cloud, just make sure it's nice and thick. Leaving some openings in the cloud can also be fun. And then I think we'll zoom out a little bit and we'll start working on some of the larger surrounding clouds. Then maybe we go back and we do some additional smaller ones as well, but I think it's all a process of going back and forth and feeling it out. I say that and then I continue to put paint on the canvas because I just find it to be too much fun. Okay. Zooming out. So from there, we'll approach the larger clouds at the top, and I'm going to do so initially with the larger flat-headed brush because, as you can see, there's just a grand amount of space to cover. Now, I'm going to be strategic with this in that I'm only going to paint in the middle of large areas, and then I'll do the edging with a different brush. But this will be a good base. It'll get us started. It'll be cathartic to apply this much pigment to canvas after working with the tiny little brush. And I really find if I can space out my paintings, going back and forth between the big brushes and the little brushes, I'm often pretty happy because it just keeps me engaged and I don't feel like things get too repetitive that way. And when you paint landscapes, you do a lot of repetitive work, which, again, if you space out well, can feel just quite cathartic and relaxing. create these almost meditative states where you can turn your brain off and paint intuitively and really just enjoy that process. But I think this is a really good start, making sure that we have a nice thick base for all of these central areas. It's worth noting that the centers need to be the most thick, and then the areas on the outskirts can be a bit less so, because the edges of clouds are innately going to be more thin, where the center has more dense actual cloud mass. So we do try to keep that balanced. Now we'll grab a bit more here. Going to head into the bottom, and remember, the bottom, while detailed, is going to likely be a little bit less detailed than the top. Though as we get closer and closer to the subjects, so as the subjects get higher up and therefore less of a distance to us, we are going to see more detail. So this cloud will be more detailed than these clouds. And that means both the top and the bottom will have additional taps and strokes. So you can see we're even doing that here. Very good. Very good. Okay. Have this wonderfully condensed area. I feel like this side of the canvas is getting a little too busy for this side though. So now we need to start balancing things. My brush is damp so that I can get these really tiny markings, but it's also getting to the point where I'm not getting the opaque thick pigment I'm looking for. So I'm going to try to grab more of the thicker pigment from this, the less watery areas. We still want water on our brush, we just don't want too much. You can see when I grab water, I'm still wiping it off on the canvas. And each stroke will be a little bit different. We are just feeling it out with each application, and that's okay. I think things are already starting to feel much more balanced with the right and the left-hand side. Little taps. You can see the openings in the cloud are quite unique. What we have here we don't see anywhere else, and we do want to maintain that variance throughout. There we go. Again, lots of detail work towards the edges of the clouds that are closest to us. If you can hear some great painting ASMR in the background, that is in part my partner who's doing an oil painting today, a portrait. And I'm going to try to get her to give me some lessons so that maybe we could do some portraits together in the future. She's very, very talented with that. I feel like I always just had this innate love for landscape, so I do a lot of those, but it's fun to play in other subjects, mediums. I've been playing a little bit with oils lately. Okay, so far so good. It's amazing the variance once you have a completed area of cloud versus something that's just still in that beginning framework. Trying to create a real flow to it. Create some leading lines that bring us back down here. Make different areas more thick. Trying to make this neck a little bit smaller. Throw some tiny clouds around it to make this look bigger. Scale comparison is so important. There we go. And this is one of those things where you can do a lot in a cloud and then you can jump to a different cloud before finishing if you're unsure of how much detail you want to add, and often finishing another cloud will tell you a lot about the cloud you're currently working on because it'll dictate how much detail is in that general vicinity and how much you need to add. So you'll see me jumping around from cloud to cloud. I'm not really committing to finishing anything that I've worked on at this point, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so from there, again, heading towards this top area, have these little pieces that find their way out. Quite fun. You can see how it's kind of flicking up. That's how we add an extra level of dimensionality. Once it gets close to us, the clouds aren't just moving horizontally. They're also a bit more playful in the verticals. I don't want to do too much of it, but it is something I want to accentuate because it's new to the piece and I think a very lovely part of it. So let's continue. Love that ASMR. Just sounds great. So relaxing. Also kind of inspiring. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy exercising. And sometimes when I want to get in the mood to exercise, I'll put on videos where other people are. And then you just see it happening, you get inspired, you like the sounds. And I think a big part of that here is with painting too. It's just building that inspiration, living in that space before you approach it. And you can approach it in a way that just feels really good. There we go. Love the playful motions that we have going on there. I think because of that, we can now add some over here. Expand. Like what we talked about. Areas aren't done until we're done other areas, and then we can see just how much we want to build. Interesting bridging point across there. We also want some that kind of lead in from the side of the canvas. We don't want them to all just exist within the canvas, otherwise it looks a little unrealistic. So make sure to add some little portions on the edge that work their way in, and it can be great because it also acts as leading lines in the piece as well. We will need to go back into a lot of these and build some depth, but as for first applications go, I'm feeling really, really happy with what we've accomplished. A lot of great line work. Okay, so everything is nice and dry to the touch. We are going to start adding some of these lovely orange highlights to the bottoms of our clouds, the areas that will receive just those hints of light. And we're going to do so by taking our larger flat-headed brush, this one right here, and we'll do a brand new mix of an abundance of our titanium white. We will need our cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, render something similar to what we did in this area of the sky right here, with an emphasis on the orange. And we can switch over to our liner brush, grab that, head into the base of some of these clouds and then tap in these little bits of light which will work their way around some of these, but predominantly just exist towards the base of them. And this is a lot of finite detail work. I like it when it's a little bit wet because then it's semi-opaque and you can kind of see a bit of a gradient work its way up the darker, almost bluish hue. But you can see that it's all quite minute. We want this to be subtle, subtle, subtle. But we will find our way. Should match quite well down here, though towards the bottom you can even cover entire clouds because there will just be so much of this warm light working not only behind them but around them as a whole in the distance. So you can see that we're applying this over the entirety of it, and it kind of pushes them back. It gives us some extra depth, and that can be a good look. Then we can go back down towards the bottom, reinstigate some of those warmer hues yet again, build those up, more opaque, and now we have a gradient of these highlights as well. Pretty lovely. And it starts subtle, but we will build this into something that feels a bit more complete. There we go, right underneath. Have a little bit of a blend up just towards the bottom. And a lot of the orange is going to sit pretty naturally in the base, quite subtle, but the higher up we go, the more it becomes noticeable because we no longer have that orange backdrop. And when it's against the blue, the complementary color, it really tends to stand out. So we want to lessen the amount as we move up and forward, but we still want it to be just bracing those edges. So I'm not doing as much, it's more watery. Trying to keep it somewhat subtle. So far so good. We have extra depth, it's more dynamic. The painting as a whole feels a bit more complete. We no longer just have oranges at the bottom and blues at the top, now we have a good mix. And that in itself keeps the eye moving in a more dynamic way. There we go. Lots of little ones. Lots of details we can add. This is one of those parts that does get quite meditative, in that we just do a lot of the same thing, but in different areas, just getting to exercise that catharsis in general. Again, I'm looking for anything towards the bottom of a cloud that could be receiving light from here. Couple little honks. There we go. And I'll go over the more prominent areas a couple of times until we build up the opacities that we want. So sometimes it's going to be a singular application, sometimes it'll be multiple. It'll be dependent on the area and also your own personal preference. There we go. Quite lovely. Softening these in the distance. Breaking some apart with more of the orange. Just makes it a bit more dynamic. Okay, so now we're going to get a bit closer. And as you can see on the horizon, there's this, it looks like a cloud, it looks like mist, it's kind of this ambiguous in between. That's what we're going to render right across here next. And we're going to do so using the larger flat-headed brush to mix up a mixture of our cadmium orange, our ultramarine blue, quite a bit of our titanium white. And let me zoom this out for you for a second. I want to keep this close because it is a real detail, but I do want you to see the mix. So we're looking for an in-between of these two pigments right here. I think we will need a little bit of that oxide black. So far, I like this color a lot. I think it should lean more towards blue than orange though, so we'll just double down on that for a minute. And then we'll go in with a test right down here. And I like it, it's close. Again, I think slightly more blue makes it perfect. Using the larger flathead, doing a little bit of a blend up into our previous clouds. And then whenever there's a movement this way with the clouds, we can just interject this, have a hint of it, make it nice and cohesive in the space. Aim for a nice clean horizontal line towards the bottom. And then work it across. Now it's quite reflective at the moment, so it's not going to look as dark as it actually is, but we'll just give it a little bit time to dry, and I think it'll be the perfect color. Again, working it up here softly, just letting it become nice and cohesive with the rest of the piece. Little bits of refinement towards the bottom. And we can refine the bottom line here as well later when we add in details to the water, but the cleaner we get it now, the easier our lives are in a little bit. Might also take a little bit working into our bottom clouds. Here and there. Overall, I think I like that a lot as just a simple base. If we want, we can soften the top of it with a little bit of a blend. And for that, I think we do switch back to the filbert. Make sure it's nice and damp. Let those rounded corners create those feathered edges, like so. All in all, I think that's a pretty solid application. We'll let it dry and then we'll go back in if we need to. If not, we'll just proceed taking more of that ultramarine blue, more of that oxide black, hint of our titanium white, and we'll start working on the distant land right through there. Now with this, we want it to be quite blue. We also want there to be a lot of room to make it darker. So we're not going in with the darkest mix first. And that's going to be through here. It's actually going to be above a lot of these clouds. And then it's going to work its way back down. Like that. There we go. Make sure it's nice and thick. We can do more on the horizon. However, our real detail work is of course done with the liner. Like so. Just adding details where we can, but not too many because it is still in the distance and we won't see all of them. Okay, now after taking a step back, I feel like I like the color, but it could be a little bit brighter just so we have more room to make it darker along the edges in these areas right here later. So I just interjected a little bit of extra titanium white into our mix. We are going to splash that atop our previous application and we'll fill this out. There we go. Lots of good applications to still be made, but the ones that we have so far I'm very happy with. We can even add a little bit more light towards the tops of these because light will wrap around them. The bottom will have more shadows, the top will have more light. You can even interject some brush strokes for the sake of creating texture in the distant land masses. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. And I'm trying to do some brush strokes that are leading us down this way to create leading lines, direct the eye towards the center, but also just make it a little bit more dynamic. So, all in all, I think that's a better application. I think it's stronger. I like the color. And I think I'm going to leave this for now. Of course, as I say that, I continue to play with it. But I have a lot of fun. So, now we'll leave this for a little bit. We'll start working on what we have on the left and the right here, which is these larger land masses with trees on them. So, that means a darker mix, more of our Oxide black, goes to about here. We still have the blue in the mix, we still have the titanium white. I start with a larger flathead, as you can see. We want a nice sharp line to our edge. And then I'm going to go in with a vertical tapping and a little bit of a drag application with this brush to start creating the peaks of some trees, like so. I like that a lot. Go a little bit darker for the base. Let the top be a little bit brighter. Again, now look at the variance between these two. Doesn't this dark area make that look fantastic? The contrast between the two. And it's each other that makes it look great. If you had just one, it would look a little basic, but the mix, that's where it gets special. Now, we'll grab the liner. We'll go in with some intentionality with the protrusions. We started this with the vertical application. Now we're really hammering home some definitive areas. It's looking really good. Remember, the smaller you make these, the greater the scale you apply to the landmass as a whole. So I'm just really refining, sharpening, like so. Alright, now we will head on over to the other side and complete something similar. However, I'm just about out of pigment. So we're just going to remix what we were working with there. We'll do a little test, make sure that it's a good match for what we already have on the other side. And then once we are convinced and happy, we'll jump on over here, create a line for what will be the horizon of it, though that doesn't matter that much because we are going to do a reflection of it right down below. I just find it's easier to break the top and the bottom down rather than doing it at once. And here we're going to go in with some of those more intentional vertical markings, which don't have to be perfect. It's just a start. Want a good thick coat of paint. That's really the primary objective of this larger flat-headed brush. And this landmass will come down probably to about here. Make sure that's nice and thick. Fill that through, like so. Okay, now we still have a bit of refining. So, we'll grab the liner, head back over here. You can see I'm using my pinky finger to ground my hand. That's just going to give me a little bit more intentionality and control. It'll take the shake out of my hand. I know when I'm painting for a long time and I forget to eat or have water, I do get a little shaky. And this can just help me work through that. Though, the real fix is making sure that you are well hydrated and don't skip the meals. So, friendly reminder, do take care of yourself. Make sure you are being healthy, because that's important too. I find I paint a lot better when I feel well, so do take care of yourself. And I'm wishing you all good health. That said, love these trees back here, so nice and sharp. Let's continue that trend up towards the top left. Sharpen, refine. There we go. We're doing great. At this point, it almost looks like we have half of the painting almost done. Of course, there's a lot we can go back to and touch up and fix, but so far, very, very happy. I think from here, we start our reflection, and this is going to be interesting. It's going to be a bit different than how we've done the top. We're not doing a clean, perfect reflection of the trees. If we look here, we can just see that there's this darker area kind of pitter-pattering left and right with these horizontal markings, the movements of the water. That's something we are going to try to be cognizant of and work within the idea of. And I'm going to start by covering up the white of the canvas with that same pigment we've been working with, like so. Again, nice and easy beginnings, just blocking in. And I always like starting subjects with these easy beginnings because it makes it feel as a whole so much more achievable, successful. You get that rust off, you get introduced to the subject in a way that isn't going to feel intimidating or like too much. So we start with that, and then we switch on over to the liner brush. We grab more of that pigment. We start to make horizontal little markings left and right, where we bring these shadows out. And as we get farther and farther away from us, they get smaller and smaller. I think we can bring the land down a little bit. But for the most part, we are just doing these little taps, drags, back and forth until we are out of the vicinity of the reflection. And we'll also take more of the colors that we have down here and we'll work them up into that space. But we don't have those mixed right now, so in the meantime, we are just going in with these horizontal back and forths, smaller and smaller into the distance, as we've noted, leaving larger openings as we get closer to us. You can see just how quickly it all starts to feel right, come together once you get that technique and that idea down. Really enjoying this. One of those things that's just genuinely really fun to paint. Had this picture saved for a couple of weeks now, so it's been really nice to explore and finally bring it to fruition. I find often when I think about paintings for a couple of weeks, I do a better job just because I have more time to internalize the applications, the colors, the subjects as a whole, what changes I want to make, what I want to commit to. And I think this piece is a good reflection of that idea. So there's a lot more we can do out here, but I think we do that with a different color, and we just appreciate this as the great start that it is. Okay, so jumping back into this, we are now going to start working on some of these additional little horizontal applications, splatters, taps, all of the different reflections that we have in the water. And I think the easiest way to go about this is starting right underneath and around these areas and these reflections. We still need to separate these areas of land, and we'll start with the larger flat-headed brush. We'll grab some of our titanium white, grab a little bit of our ultramarine blue, hint of our oxide black, minimal amounts of the blue and the black, hint of our orange as well, but we do want this to be more of a bluish gray, so there is more blue in this mix right here. Yet again, I also like to start with a minimal amount of paint when I'm starting a brand new color like this, and then slowly add to the mix, because that'll give us more room to correct things, especially if we need to dramatically. Once we have that, we will switch back to the liner, make sure it's nice and damp. I'm going to head over towards the side of the canvas for a second, just so I have a different angle. Don't get my hand in the way while we're painting. And then this is similar to this pigment, so we can actually do some little openings in the water through here. But what's most important is we head up to here, that separation between the land and the water. Lots of little taps and drags, like so. And then we let that dissipate as we move out. And just like that, we have a good start to a bit more depth. I might refine that line here and there. Move it up a hint. But we're just going to approach it slowly with small applications. You can see that it also moves inwards and up, where on the outside here it's a bit more low on the canvas. By making taps, we also make sure some areas are brighter, some areas are darker, and that makes it look more dynamic. Some areas will have more shadow, some will have less. And once we have those markings, again, we build out in ways that feel like they make sense. There we go. Really, really like all of these subtle transitions into what will eventually be a much more detailed Beautiful water. You can see I'm going back and forth between the sides. As I build one, I get more information about how I can build the other. That looks good. Now I realize I can go a little bit more dramatic on this side as well. Doubling down on the areas that I really like, making them more opaque, but leaving some to be nice and subtle. It's not all one or the other. Now I think we take this big brush, we wipe off some of that excess pigment, we make more of an orange mix, orange, cad yellow. You know what comes after that? Almost always the titanium white. Thicken it, desaturate it. Grab a bit more. There we go. Perfect. I think that's very much akin to what we had through here. Now let's make those little tap and drags enter the space. Same way that we made the darker pigments exit outward. Trying to get this speckled effect almost in the distance. The more we go back and forth with these, the better this is going to look. There we go. I like that. Doing a great job. Want to make sure that the inside of these taps is nice and opaque, but the edges can be a little bit more feathered, semi-transparent, and that'll give us a little bit of a glowing look in pieces of it. But we want there to be a real transition from one to the next. If you end up doing too much of one, you can always go back, add in the darker pigment, so don't be wary of it. Get exploratory, get playful, and enjoy. Okay, now, this color that we have through here would also look great starting to work in those spaces. So how do we get that? We take our previous orange, we add more titanium white, we add a hint of our ultramarine blue, we add a hint of our oxide black, we make it more of a grayish orange, and we'll give this a try. I didn't mix too much just in case we're off, and that actually looks really good. So we'll grab this, we'll start working those horizontal highlights inwards. Very happy with these applications. Now let's head on over to the other side. You can see in the reference photo that there's very little larger blocky areas. Most of it is comprised of some level of detail going back and forth between dark and light hues. That's something we're trying to keep in mind here, that we are just getting started and it will look a little bit awkward initially because we have so much texture and movement in here and then nothing out here. So this is really something we do need to tackle, and we can start by grabbing more of this pigment, and we can start bringing that out into this middle section. So this is a big step. We're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to believe in the end course. But this is good. And the idea is it almost looks like nothing in this mid zone where we're essentially color matching, but then we bring it up into the orange where you can start to see it. It's not dramatic, but it is a detail, it is a texture, it is moving us in that direction. We'll do that for a little while, trying to make it nice and small. Almost like taps in the background, because eventually you don't really see the detail. But then we also move it down towards us, and we can again lose it in that middle area and then start to see it as it approaches the blues that come right after. It's a really easy way of approaching water because it's just a lot of horizontal markings that eventually turn into something that feels very realistic. But it's not a complicated blend, it's not something you have to get the timing right, it's just about layering and intentionality with a lot of little taps and drags. As we get closer to us, those taps do turn into drags. They become more horizontal, like so. Very good. Then we can start putting them on a little bit of an angle. You can see how this is becoming more diagonal as we get closer to us. Again, seeing more detail in the actual movements of the water. And we can start combining different areas. And these are all areas of water which are catching light, creating a highlight, a shimmer of sorts. That's pretty lovely. So again, it's going to go through its awkward stages. That's okay. We just need to paint on till we get to this step. And I think at this point, it's starting to become real. We can see the vision unfold, right? Now as we get closer and closer to us, I'm also going to do a bit more of a tapped, bumpy aesthetic to this line work. So rather than it being a tap and a drag, it's a lot of taps that amalgamate to looking like a drag from a bit of a distance. And that's going to give us an additional amount of texture. Oh yeah. Doesn't that just look like light shimmering on the water? At least the first steps of it. Really happy with how this is turning out. It's also happening rather quickly. Normally these paintings take a long time, but I think I was just so excited to paint this sunset that it's really just flowing. I've had a lot of time to think about it. Now we're being rewarded for having it in the back of our heads. I believe I posted the Patreon video of sketching it and the reference photo last week. So if you're up over on Patreon, you've also probably been thinking about it for a good amount of time, and I think you'll be able to approach this pretty confidently, like I am. Also, of course, as always, big thank you to everybody who is up over on Patreon. Thank you for making these videos happen. This channel is predominantly community funded. You are the community who is making it what it is. And I couldn't do this if it wasn't for you. I think it's pretty amazing that in 2025 there is still such support for fine art and tangible tactile art. I think a lot of the world is moving towards digital art, and the fact that we are still here painting with a physical medium is pretty wonderful. So thank you for keeping the medium alive and healthy and keeping it just such a important part of our lives. Getting lots of taps and drags, trying to make the edges a little bit less detailed than the center area because I don't want the attention to move off the painting. Easy way to do that is to keep the majority of your detail and contrast towards the middle. So there's a lot more we're going to do to this water to make it look realistic. So hang in there. I know this process is taking a little while, but it'll pay off. There we go. Okay, I think I'm going to grab a glass of water. Just make sure that we are staying healthy and hydrated, and then we'll jump right back into this. Alright, so this is all nice and dry to the touch. We are going to start applying the shadows, which you can see in the water here, and this will be a really fun application because it's similar to what we did, but it will give it a lot more depth. So we are going to grab our flat-headed brush, grab some of our Ultramarine blue. All of this is fully dry on the side, so I'm not really worried about it blending with any of our other pigments. We'll grab some titanium white because we don't want it to be too dark. It should still be brighter than what we have here, but darker than anything we have in the water aside from that space. So we render something nice and blue, nice and dark, relatively thick. And I think this will be a great next step pigment. Switching over to the liner brush, grabbing just a little bit. I'm going to start on the edge because it's the least important. And oh yeah, that'll be great. So now what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, where is the shadow going to be? And the answer is it's going to be on the backs of waves that are opposite to where the light's coming from. So the light's coming this way. That means the front of the wave is going to have highlight, and then the back of the wave is going to be in shadow. So often it'll be towards the back of our highlights. So we're going in essentially to the areas we've done before, right behind all of the oranges, and we're starting to interject these shadows, which can and will also work their way out into the middle area that combines these protrusions and these highlights. Now this is going to leave us with 3 values. That's going to be the highlight, this darker pigment we are currently applying, and the mid value, which is the initial gradient that we incorporated. So 3 pigments right now. The more we add, typically, the more unique and interesting this is going to look. But this is a great start. There we go. We'll do more. We'll build out. You can see I'm predominantly staying towards the edges in the beginning. Good practice for the technique. And I like to start around the bigger waves, and then I slowly combine them with other waves. Already this area looks so much more complete. Trying to use a fairly watery brush. Much like the rest of our applications, that tap and drag is going to do wonders. We're looking for really clean lines. So if your brush starts to get a little dry and it's harder to apply that pigment, do grab some extra water, grab some extra paint, and then go back in. Don't try to force it, don't try to drag it when there isn't an easy glide. And then as we get slightly farther back, we're going to make our markings smaller, much like we did with the oranges and the highlights. Again, I recommend practicing towards the side. And then we can move our way into the middle as we start to feel a little more comfy with the techniques. It's also worth noting that I'm running out of pigment on my brush right now, so I'm getting very watery applications. And I like that towards the middle because it makes it look like these markings are brighter. So it creates almost an extra level of values in there as well. Now here is a bit of a close-up look. And a lot of this is starting to dry. So you can see that it's looking a little bit brighter. Typically, as pigment dries, it looks darker because acrylics dry darker. However, if you're going into very thin applications and it's quite watery, when it dries it'll probably look brighter because a lot of that darkness came from a reflection, it just being wet, not actually a dark pigment. So this time I'm going to try going in with a little bit more thick pigment, that way I know what it really looks like. And I might go back over some of these areas and thicken them up. Just try to make it look a little bit more professional. That said, we can also go back in and reintroduce a lot of the highlights in later steps, and that'll have a good impact as well. It's really about going back and forth with water. We had some shadows, we had some highlights, we had some shadows, we had some highlights. As we get farther away like this, more semi-transparent applications, smaller taps and drags. Pretty soon we're going to meet these reflections, and that is going to feel really good. Yeah, right there. Also, I don't know if you noticed, we've gotten quite lucky in that the construction sounds completely stopped. It did start raining earlier, and I think everybody decided, you know what? Probably time to go home. That's kind of nice. We have a relaxing painting day. They get to have some time off. We get a more relaxed painting video for you. There we go. Again, the new place should be pretty quiet all the time. We're hoping. It's a new building, so we'll see, but we'll hope. If not, we'll make it work. I'm really excited to see the sunsets. Looking at south and west units. Right now we have one that looks east. So we get great sunrises, but we don't get sunsets. And I feel like there are sunrise people and there are sunset people, and I think I'm admittedly a sunset person. So I'm excited for some sunsets. The benefit of the current painting setup, the way we're doing it now, is I don't really need a big painting setup. I don't need a big room, I don't need a lot of lights, and even while moving, I can still probably record videos like this pretty consistently. Anything, the challenge is just being busy, packing the boxes, moving things about. But so far so good. Okay, now we'll take a step back just so we get multiple perspectives. I am a big believer that when you're painting, you should be painting up close and then far away, and then up close and then far away. That way you can see what the details of the painting look like, but you also know what it'll look like in a room, because, as we typically talk about, when you see a painting for the first time, you don't see it from half a foot away, you see it from half a room away. You see it from maybe 10, 12 feet, if not more. So we want to make sure that it looks good from a distance. We want to make sure that it looks good up close. Best way to do that is to look at it from a distance and up close throughout the painting process. So trying to be mindful of that, trying to remember to do so. Trying to double down on some of the line work that I really like. There we go. Really, really enjoying this piece. You know, some paintings you get really excited about the end result, and some paintings you really enjoy just putting that paint down. This is definitely a painting where it's both. Very fun to paint, very fun to imagine where it's going. Still a lot of work to be done in the water, but I'm excited to do this together. I think because we are moving up here, I do need to start using smaller brush strokes. Probably take the majority of the pigment off elsewhere in the canvas. And then soon we'll head back up here. Again, smaller marks. My brush is a little bit more watery than it was. Let it dissipate as you move into the center. There we go. Still trying to aim for under the little highlighted areas. We have an abundance of them. And they're really subtle in this space. They're hard to see, but we should still be mindful of them and try to aim for right underneath rather than on top or through. This is also a big step because we're finally moving towards the center of the canvas a bit more. We need a good transition from those darker shadows into the softer shadows. Realistically, the water's still moving in the same way through here, but it's getting more light in the center, just by virtue of where the opening for the sun is. There we go. We'll need to introduce highlights back into the middle, but I think for now it's working well. You can see how subtle we're getting in this part of the space. I didn't change the mix, I just let the pigment run out elsewhere. I have a bit more water on my brush. We're letting that detail pile up. We're avoiding the highlights. And we're getting somewhere. Pretty lovely. Now, because I had to grab more pigment, I'm heading off to the sides where there are darker areas first. Take off the majority of it. And then once we start to run out, then I'll finish up the middle section. We took a little bit of a break from, well, we had too much pigment on our palette, rather on our brush. Starting to give it that reflective, speckled moving quality. And we want to move this into the orange. This deserves to be textured too, though it is quite far away, and eventually it just essentially turns into horizontal lines because it's an amalgamation of these little speckles here, condensed and compressed. Now let's go back up to the top. Do more of these. Pretty lovely. Gets me quite excited for the summer months soon ahead. I think I want to do a camping trip this year. Haven't in a while. Spend some time out by the water. We don't fish, but I think just a nice little canoe kayak ride out on water like this feels really good. We're also going to head to the Toronto Island, which we did do last year. You see all of these wonderful sailboats out there. So maybe we'll take some more reference photos. I took quite a few reference photos last year. I think one of the real beauties of modern technology and the fact that we all have phones is that we have great cameras with us at all times. So when you're out and you're going for these walks and these strolls, you can take reference photos. You can take palettes from paintings like this that you spend some real time with, get a good understanding of, and you can interject those into your paintings of your own reference photos. It's always a big goal of this channel. It's not just teaching you how to paint this image or that image, it's teaching you how to paint. So when you have an image in your head or some inspiration, you can tackle that as well. That said, there is a tier up over on Patreon where you can subscribe, and I will paint a lesson about your reference photo. So if you have a painting idea, a photo that you took on a trip, or maybe you want it to be a gift for somebody, if you subscribe at that tier on Patreon, I will paint your image, show you how to do it, and I'll even send you the painting. So if you're interested, that's up there. You can also find a bunch of bonus lessons. I think they're over 100 now, which you can't find on YouTube. So if you're looking for more painting videos, they're there in abundance. You can also get the big painting series where I work on 24, 36-inch canvases, ones that are, 8, 9, 10 times the size of this. Put a lot of detail and time into those. You can also get all my ebooks up there, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first. We talk about light, shadows, values, which brushes to use, water, thinning our pigment, complementary colors and different color palettes, how light wraps around subjects, a bunch of good stuff. I feel like we're really getting somewhere now. Okay. Now this is a portion of the painting, a subject that we can just do for hours on end, so for your sake, I feel like I should probably conclude these taps relatively soon so we can jump into the next step. But this really has been a fun step, and I am going to have troubles putting the brush down. So many little areas to brush up and make more notable. It's a little tricky, but I do really like it. Okay. Okay. Let's do a couple more taps, and let's move on to the next step together. Now, as we can see in the reference photo, there's actually this very bright highlight of bluish gray in this middle area. It does move up into here, it moves back. That is essentially the next step. It is a big step, but it will make a big difference. So, let's start mixing. Let's have some fun. Alright, so from here, we are grabbing that larger flat-headed brush. We are making a bit of a gray initially, hint of our Oxide black, a lot of the titanium white, hint of our ultramarine blue, and you can see with both the Oxide black and the ultramarine blue, taking off the excess elsewhere. Then we're just bringing a little bit in at a time. That way it's never excessive and we can work with something quite a bit more subtle. We don't want this to look like a pure titanium white, and I think despite the fact that on the palette it does look like it has hue and it looks a little bit darker, because it's going to go on here and there aren't really any off-white areas, we do need to make it a little bit darker, a little bit more pigmented. And I'm also mixing just more of the pigment that way. No, we don't have to remix too much. That said, I think that right there is a really nice pigment. And I think it's time we switch back to our liner. So we'll make that nice and damp. We'll grab our pigment, and it's coming in. This will predominantly be around the middle. This will be like a highlight, so I'm going to place it into areas that should be brighter. So not over the darker spots. And this is really how we build the best water. We go back and forth, highlights, shadows. So much detail in these spaces now, between the taps and the drags. And initially, as we talk about, it's going to look a little awkward. That is just what happens when we introduce a new value, a new hue into the painting. We're using colors that we have before, so in the end it should feel nice and cohesive, but because it is so stark, and these are our first applications, it's going to take a little bit to get used to. I'm not going to do this to all of it. I am predominantly working in this central area, at least to begin with. I'm going to be careful. I'm going to be very careful. There we go. Again, as we get closer to us, it becomes more of a pitter-patter. Like so. And I'll be honest, we haven't done much already. This looks so much better. It's far from perfect, it's far from done, but the amount of realism these little taps can add is just so abundant. We're doing it rather quickly too, which is nice because the sun is starting to set. I would love to do this in natural light today. Always a great feeling painting a sunset during a sunset. There we go. Now, because this is pretty watery, as it's drying, it's becoming less and less visually apparent. So we'll go over our favorite areas again and again till we get it the way we really want to. There we go. I like that. I like that a lot. We've been focusing towards the right-hand side quite a bit, so let's do more on the left. And that'll tell us how much more we can do on the right. You never know, we might be able to expand. We only know when we're finished over here. There we go. Also, I don't know if we've talked about it yet this episode. If you'd like to work with the same brushes that I use in these videos, you can pick up my brush set in the video description. That way you never have to worry about if your brush is too thick or too thin, if it's the right stiffness. I believe we only have 20 sets left in stock, so probably going to sell out pretty soon. So if it's something you've been thinking about, now is probably a good time to commit. But it is a 5-piece brush set. I feel like when I started painting, I was one of those people who just bought an endless amount of brushes, and I'd always get excited when I went to the art store, get a new size, a new shape, and then the more I painted, the more I realized I liked a very minimal set of brushes That way I could be consistent with my strokes and my applications. I got very comfortable with all of the brushes that I had, and I also felt like you could do pretty much everything with 5 brushes. So I put together a brush set that was only 5 brushes. That way you're not buying a bunch of extra brushes you don't have to. And the brush set that we put together and we made, I've been using for the last 2 years. So it's held up well. Still very happy with it. Wouldn't make any changes. We haven't used the smaller flat-headed brush or the fan brush from it in this video, but those do really come in handy in cityscapes and more foliage dense paintings. Here we go. Maybe we'll start moving up here. Lots of these little horizontal taps. And this is going to get quite interesting because now we're putting the blues and the highlighted blues right beside the highlighted oranges, which is something we don't have. We have the shadows from the blues, but we don't have the highlights. I think this is creating a really nice look. This is one of those steps that I've been excited for. I knew was coming, but I didn't want to skip to because we needed the foundations and everything else first. But this is one of those applications that just, you apply it, you close your eyes, you look back at the painting, and you feel like it's a whole new painting. It just feels so good. So that's the goal. I'm painting these over our boats because realistically we're going to paint our boats over the water, so it doesn't really matter. Might also take some of this and work it back into these areas. Make them all nice and cohesive together. Also, now that we have much more bright areas through here, we can make these more bright and it'll feel like it makes sense. Might also do some additional taps. There we go. So far, so good. More taps through and through. And I might do a little diffused look towards the back. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to make my water and my paint almost like watercolor. I'm going to head back here. I'm going to apply it over the orange. And then like a wash, I'm going to bring it out. This is just going to soften the orange. It's going to make it a little bit more glassy. You don't have to do it if you like the intensity of the orange, but I think it'll bring everything together quite nicely. Yeah, I like that. Now we'll just double down on some of our favorite areas up here. You can see that the edges don't have this pigment. Not really, not in abundance. Going to keep it that way. As we expanded, it was something I questioned, but now that we are where we are, I think I can say pretty definitively that we are keeping these lighter bluish grays towards the center, and I'm very happy doing so. I think we should probably go with a bit of a brighter value, but great start to this application. So now at this point, we are just going to grab some extra titanium white, work that into our previous mix, using that larger flat-headed brush. This isn't a pure titanium white, it still does have the blue and the oxide black in it, just not as much. And we'll use this very specifically, very intentionally, towards the centers. Draw the eye in towards the middle of the painting. Create some additional sharp lines to really just solidify the waves. And I'm not going to do too much with it, but I am going to really try to deliver the eye in a lovely way, subtle way. There we go. If it ever gets to be too much, you can always go back to a darker pigment. Create some little separation lines. So don't worry about overdoing it. Easy thing to kind of work backwards, but something to consider. I'm going to clean our brush quite well. I'm going to grab a little bit more of this. I'm going to listen to the doggo outside. Not our doggo. I am unfortunately allergic to dogs. It's quite tragic because I love them and I would love to have one in and around life. Maybe one day they'll have a proper cure. And those of us who are allergic to dogs will really get to experience all the love those little ones have to offer. And of course, give them so much love back. That'd be pretty nice. Okay, now I don't want to bring this highlight too high because there is this really nice intense orange in the middle. What we're applying now is more the light from that central area. So I think at this point we probably take a step back, evaluate if we want more or less of this. Again, doing so from a distance. That way we have a realistic view of what it actually looks like. And then we can come back in and either continue adding highlight or we can move on to the next step. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes. I let everything fully dry to the touch, and I'm going to do something which you don't have to do, but I want to show you, I want you to watch before you proceed. If you love your water, don't do this next step. If you'd like to change it to just be a little bit less contrast heavy, a little bit more cohesive as a whole, then we can do this together. That said, I'm going to do a wash over the water to give it just a slightly more bluish, maybe even green look. That'll take the lights through here, the darks through here, even them out just a little bit. That way nothing looks overly complicated. And I'm going to do so very simply by taking a hint of our Ultramarine, a hint of our Cadmium Yellow Deep Hue. These two together will render a green. We'll grab a hint of our Cadmium Orange, like so. Double down into a couple of these. We'll make the mix bigger. We'll make the mix very watery. And then, I'm just going to apply this over the front, starting here. And then I'm bringing it up. I'm not going to have a dramatic impact because it's almost like painting with watercolor. We're not changing any of the subjects, the line work. We're just evening out the values a little bit to make the painting slightly more subtle. And the more we spread it out, the more subtle it gets. And just like that, I'm honestly very, very happy. Again, you don't have to. You can make it more blue, you can make it more orange, you can do whichever of these you like, but I think this is really nice, and what's also great is now we've added just a thin layer of water to this, so when we go and apply the pigment for our boats, it'll go on much more smoothly. So speaking of said boats, we do have quite a few in here, and I'm going to grab quite a bit of our Oxide black, titanium white, a little bit of our blue. We are going to go for something quite dark and silhouetted, maybe akin to what we have here, and that's what I'll actually use as a test. So we'll just put some pigment on, see how it looks. I think, you know what, this is good, but it could be a little bit darker. Try that. And this is also great because I wanted to thicken up these areas anyway, just make them slightly more opaque. So it's one of those things where there are multiple benefits to this application. Though once we have what we want, we switch back over to the liner, and I'm going to paint in the boats. Now, again, if you'd like help with the drawing process, these are in the traceable up over on Patreon. We're trying to figure out boats in various dimensions. This is going to be a very thin initial application. Have a lot of water on my brush. We'll need to go back and build it up, but for now, quite happy. You can see I'm doing one boat at a time. You can also see that there we go. You can also see that the boats typically work in front of each other. It was that way in the reference photo, and I changed it a bit, but I really like the fact that this boat is in front of this boat is in front of this boat, and that looks great because it just creates these added layers of depth into the painting. Just going to look at this one up close. Okay, so the nose of it's over here, and then it comes down, like so. Very good. So now there are three boats that are essentially placed in front of each other. Right now we're just getting in the general shapes. I want one over here. Once we add the masts and all of that, this is going to be really, really lovely. We have another. I moved this boat more to the side. I wanted it kind of overlapping with the shadows here. I just thought that could be a really good look. Complexify it a bit rather than having them all out in the middle. Then there's some little ones back here, which I didn't initially paint on, but now that we can see how much detail we have in the water, I think we could do a couple. So this is layer number 1. We're also going to add these nice tall pieces, being very careful to not make it too thick. Means going back a couple of times, more water. There we go. I think we'll do another one for here. There we go. These are still just the early beginnings, so everything's going to look a little rough, but just trust the process. Believe in the potential, the imagination, and we'll get there. Very happily together. There we are. Now if things feel like they're very quickly coming together, that's great. We have the little connective pieces. Should be even smaller if possible. We're working with a pretty tiny canvas, so sometimes rendering a really tiny marking can be tricky, but we are making that effort. I think that works well. Now, as these start to dry, we can go in with a bit more of a thick pigment. And this is rather stark. However, we are going to add some brighter values that will also add to the depth and the dimensions of it. Once you have that thick pigment, immediately it starts to look a lot more professional. Though, just silhouettes and simple right now. I feel like typically when we create structures in paintings, human-made subjects, I like to break it down, make it really simple. We start with simple shapes, then we move on to things like a highlight, a shadow. We don't make it too intimidating too early. I think that's important. We can also take some of this pigment with a good amount of water and create shadows with those horizontal strokes, like so. And then create a shadow for essentially the mast. And it's not going to be a perfectly straight line because we're going to have jumps of highlight and whatnot in the water. We need to account for that. This will predominantly be on the highlighted areas, not the shadow areas of the water. It's one of those things where it's a little detail, but it does a lot for the painting. Nice little shadows. Also adds to the ambiguity of the boats themselves, which is kind of nice. We don't want them to look too rigid. Already looking a lot better. Starting to capture that magic. Again, these boats are not perfect yet. That's okay. The canvas is a little bit tacky because of the wash, so when I put my finger down I notice that, and it's just something to be mindful of. We're going to do a little bit more detail work through there. Double down on the opacity of some of these while trying to keep them thin. Now we'll mix up a more blue heavy grayish mix of what we just had. So we still want it to be dark, we still want it to be gray, but we're interjecting more white and blue. Then we can add some highlights to the tops of the boats or areas that'll be receiving light. That'll typically be the rounded edges. I'm not going to apply this into the shadows. If a boat has maybe a stripe on it, you could use this as well. Really dependent on how much detail you want to throw in. There we are. Let's add some extra titanium white. This is where we just play with the values. Let's add a stripe to the top of this one. A little bit of highlight to the top of that. Not all of them. We want them to be somewhat unique while still being cohesive enough. Do a little bit of a blend with the darker hue into these so that it's not just hard lines, though the hard lines can be nice and almost impressionistic. There we go. I love that. A little more titanium white in the mix. Ooh. Can add a hint here. Be careful not to do too much, but it can also look like a sail if we do accidentally do too much. And you know what? This is something we can do a little bit of a reflection with as well. Ooh, I like that. Now we can grab some of the mid value. Maybe we do create another little boat back here, subtly by the shore. Didn't intend to initially, but feeling like it could work well enough. Grab the darker pigment, work that into the back, do a little blend. So now we're at that point where the painting can expand in a lot of ways. Quite fun. Didn't intend to have one over here, but kind of feels right, so you know what, we'll give it a try. Worst case scenario, we just paint over it with the colors of the water again. Though if you are adding in extra boats, do remember that they should have the reflections as well. All right, this is looking quite nice. Okay, so at this point, I think we go even brighter with our bluish gray. So I'm just interjecting more titanium white into that mix using the liner brush. We'll interject more of a highlight into some of the sails and the masts. Like so. Bring those to life a bit more. Of course, echo those strokes in the reflections. That's pretty neat. The way it drags down. Quite prominent and beautiful when you have the silhouettes of these in the distance. We probably don't want the highlight, at least dramatically, on this because it is very much in shadow, so we'll just do a little bit, a hint of it. Same for this. For the most part, this boat is not visible, so it's just a couple of ambiguous taps and strokes, but I think those are pretty nice ambiguous taps and strokes. Something we haven't done is a sun, which you could do. In the reference photo, it's right about here. So let's grab some titanium white, a little bit of our cad yellow, mix up something nice and warm. And again, in the reference photo, it's right below. I think I'm going to make mine a bit higher. I think we place it right there. Isn't that just lovely? We can soften it along the edges by taking off some pigment and just working it with a damp brush. But all in all, I think that actually adds a lot to the painting. Nice, subtle, warm. We could do a little bit of a reflection for it. I'm going to be quite careful. Just another minute detail. We can't make it too strong or it'll overshadow the actual sun itself, and that isn't the goal. We can grab a bit more of the titanium white, a bit more of our yellow, work that right under the clouds where it's present. I think that's pretty lovely. And I always talk about the fact that you shouldn't worry when you start a painting and it doesn't look the way you want it to, because often these pieces, acrylics, even oils, for the first, I'd say 80% of the painting, I'm kind of just trusting that we'll get there, and then in the final 10, maybe 15%, the magic happens. It starts to come together, you really see it, you feel it, it's inspiring, you just have to keep going because it's all of these things that you hoped it would be. But it doesn't get there until that final percentage. So again, there's just a lot of believing in yourself and hopefully enjoying the process. I think that's one of the most important parts of all of this. We really want to have fun making art. And I think this one is a really fun one to paint. Adding some extra yellows, warm glows into the areas right under. Just building it all out. I think this is a great intro piece out of the winter and into some warmer months. Something to keep us inspired and daydreaming about all of the fun that's just around the corner. That said, I think that's it. I think that is our painting. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the channel and this creative journey. I think that we've got a lot of really good lessons to come. I have quite a few reference photos on the computer. Like I said, this year I do want to go out and take more reference photos. At the island, there are a lot of these sailboats, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. Let me know in the comments what you would like to see me paint in the future. I'm always excited to hear that. Big thank you to everybody who does support the channel up over on Patreon. Makes lessons like these happen. If you'd like to know what we're doing in advance in the future, you can sign up over on Patreon, where I do post the traceables for these, the real-time drawing videos of said traceables, all of the bonus lessons, my ebooks, all of that fun stuff. So again, as always, a lot up there. As always, I appreciate you greatly for being there, and there's a link to that in the video description. I am going to get this packed up so that I can start getting the video ready for you. We'll take a nice thumbnail, and yeah, I hope you had a great time. If you haven't started the painting, I do recommend it. I think it's a really fun one. If you've been painting along with me, I hope you are very happy with that which you've made as well. This was such a pleasure, and again, I'll see you soon. So above all, as always, stay creative.